The War of 1812 is often overlooked in U.S. history, yet its complexity yielded some rather significant outcomes for the nation. The War of 1812 occurred from 1812, hence its name, to around 1815, despite it formally having ended in 1814. The war pits the U.S. against the British, along with Native Americans, as we will see later. So basically the way this presentation will be organized is, first we will discuss some of the major causes of the war, then we will get into the actual events that occurred during the war, and lastly, and probably more importantly, we will discuss the consequences that occurred because of the war. Just to keep in mind, throughout this presentation, important groups and individuals will be underlined. So first, let's get into the major causes of the War of 1812. So it's important to keep in mind that unlike many other wars, this war didn't really have one distinct cause. Many of the causes were equally important, making it a very complex war. So the first sort of cause we can talk about is the context that the war occurred in. Congress now consists of new young and nationalistic leaders, primarily from the south and west of the U.S. They wanted to prove themselves through war with Britain. Most notably, these new leaders included Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. It's important to keep in mind that most of these new leaders were Democratic Republicans. In fact, almost all of them were. This made them more biased towards France, which was one of the reasons that they went to war with Britain instead of France, who also actually violated many of the nation's rights. They opposed Britain, unlike the Federalist Party, which is becoming more and more weak, as we will see later. Another major cause of the war is the increasing commercial tensions with Britain and their violation of the rights of the U.S. First and foremost, the British Orders in Council were basically these policies that prevented U.S. exports and agricultural products from reaching Europe. They required U.S. ships to dock in Britain and pay tax before trading with other European countries. Many of the U.S. citizens saw this as a violation of their own rights. Another factor that enraged the U.S. was the British impressment of U.S. sailors. This was basically a process where the British forced U.S. sailors onto British ships to help fight against the French in the Napoleonic Wars. Yet another factor that greatly enraged the Americans was when the Leopard, a British ship, fired at the Chesapeake, which was a U.S. ship. This was due to the U.S. sailors supposedly enticing 4 British sailors to desert to U.S. ships. This became known as the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, and this further increased tensions among the two nations. A final major factor that increased the tensions between these nations was the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically just kind of further isolated the U.S. from Britain and made them more hostile to each other. Another very important cause that must be considered is basically Canada. The Americans had a strong desire to conquer the British-controlled Canada. Why? Because Canada was great access to timber, fishing, and the fur trade. Westward expansion and tensions with Native Americans further led to this war. Initially, the Louisiana Purchase allowed for this westward expansion that many of the Americans sought. The Warhawks were a Republican-dominated group that sought to expand west and end Native American resistance. They opposed the neutrality that was sought by Jefferson and the current President Madison. They really wanted to go to war. Like we talked about earlier, there were many new young and nationalistic leaders in the U.S. who had this new spirit of war and wanted to carry on the tradition of their ancestors of revolutionary spirit. A great example of the tensions that were building was the Battle of Tippecanoe, where William Henry Harrison brutally defeated the natives led by Chief Tecumseh. So you may ask, how did the War of 1812 relate to Native American resistance at all? Well, Americans, in particular the Warhawks, believed that Britain armed Native Americans and encouraged Native American resistance to U.S. expansion. So this just really enraged many of the Americans who thought that British was once again turning against them. And also, the War of 1812, we must keep in mind, wasn't only a war against Britain, but it was also against Native Americans themselves. So all these tensions with Native Americans are also building up in a war against them. Eventually, the Warhawks would encourage Madison to declare war against Britain by expressing to him their grievances caused by Britain. The three provocations they give to Madison to sum up the causes of war were the following. One was the impressment of sailors, also the cutting off of trade with Europe, and the interference with Native Americans in the western U.S. This basically sums up the reasons that Americans wanted to go to war with Britain. So here's a quote by James Madison that really shows how greatly he was influenced by the Warhawks and their grievances. To have shrunk under such circumstances from manly resistance would have been a degradation blasting our best and proudest hopes. It would have struck us from the high ranks where the virtuous struggles of our fathers had placed us, and have betrayed the magnificent legacy which we hold in trust for future generations. This demonstrates how he has fallen into that spirit of wanting to carry on that tradition of the ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War. Not going to war would make U.S. almost seem like unpatriotic. Madison makes it seem like the U.S. almost has a duty to fight in this war. While this doesn't exactly relate to the causes, I felt that it was probably important to mention some of the opposition to this war. We've already talked about many of the reasons Americans supported this war. In particular, the opposition stemmed from the likes of Federalists such as Daniel Webster. In particular, most of this opposition occurred in New England, as this was the place where Federalists thrived. Many of these New Englanders and Daniel Webster opposed the U.S. entering into a war with Britain because it could damage New England manufacturing interests and possibly the entire American economy. As you can see, they felt it was overall unnecessary. And also, the nature of the Federalists was to be pro-British in foreign policy, as they desired that trade and expansion of the American economy. Some major events that occurred in this war, well, we won't go too in depth. We'll talk about the American failures and victories in this war, as well as the treaty that ended it all. So, American failures in this war consisted of a U.S. attack on Canada that was immediately shut down by the British. The U.S. didn't realize that Canadians would be unwilling to join the Americans against the British. For some reason, they thought that Canada would be more loyal to the U.S. than it would be to British. Additionally, Washington, D.C. was burned by the British, as shown in the painting below. And Britain nearly won large territories in New York and New England, but this didn't end up happening. However, it was a very close call. Despite some of America's failures in the war, the U.S. also had many victories, which kind of balanced out these failures. So, despite the British Navy actually being significantly larger than the American Navy still posed a threat to the British, such as when the Battle of the USS Constitution destroyed British ships. This demonstrated that American forces could put up an effort against the British, which definitely surprised not only the Britain themselves, but also the nation of the United States. Additionally, the British failed to take Fort McHenry, which protected Baltimore. This inspired American nationalism greatly and boosted morality throughout the war. Most notably, this inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, so our national anthem comes from this war. In the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, Andrew Jackson defeated the Creek Indians, killing 300 of their warriors. This represented a major turning point in Native American influence in the West. Perhaps the most important battle in the war was the Battle of New Orleans. Despite this actually occurring after the end of the formal declaration of the end of the war, this was a devastating defeat of the British that resulted in a tremendous American pride and nationalism. This war is depicted on the right. As you can see, the US clearly has high ground over the British, representing their significant victory over them. The treaty that ended this war was known as the Treaty of Ghent, that was signed in late 1814. Basically, this declared that the war ended in a stalemate. So both countries would agree to stop fighting and restore their conquered territories. This is known as a status quo ante bellum, or the status before war. The importance of this was that it would lead America to gaining diplomatic and military respect as they put up a good fight against Britain in the war. However, initially, this treaty kind of makes the war seem insignificant, as there were really no outcomes or land changes throughout the war. This video shows how the Treaty of Ghent made it seem like the war was largely insignificant. As you can see, besides a few disputes, this war did not really change the context of North America in terms of land holdings by the British or the US. Next, we will discuss the major consequences of the War of 1812. So before I delve into the deeper consequences of this war, some of the general consequences are important to discuss as well. Basically, the Native Americans lost, which is pretty obvious. They lost a significant amount of territory, in particular land north of the Ohio River. Their influence in the West was pretty much completely diminished for the rest of US history due to this war. I mean, there was a lot of other things building up, but this war was kind of the last straw. Britain and the US, as we mentioned earlier, basically returned to the status they had been in before war. But also another slight consequence of the war was that Canadian nationalism was bolstered, and Canada would never really become part of the US, or Britain for that matter, due to this war. However, besides these general consequences, there's a lot more to be revealed about the war that at first look we don't really see when we're just looking at some short-term consequences. In terms of foreign relations, Britain accepted the existence and power of the US. They never invaded America again until 1961. Additionally, this war actually improved trading relationships with Britain, as Britain would be forced to allow trade with both themselves and other European countries. Furthermore, this war, in a sense, bolstered the US industry and sparked the Industrial Revolution. The US was forced to become more self-sufficient, as during this war, and in fact before this war, they couldn't really depend on British goods as much. Also, the defeat of Native Americans in this war encouraged further exploration and settlement of land east of the Mississippi River. Perhaps the most important consequence of this war, which was almost unintended by the Federalist Party themselves, was the demise of the Federalist Party. So, this is kind of complex, so just bear with me. The Hartford Convention was a convention dominated by New England Federalists in which they proposed various resolutions. So, this was a convention that occurred at the end of the War of 1812. And actually, the war had already ended, technically, before this convention occurred, but the Federalists who dominated this convention hadn't heard about this yet. So their main goals were to secure financial assistance from the federal government receive compensation for losses during the war, and discuss measures that they can take to reduce Republican dominance in the U.S. A very important thing to keep in mind was that some radical delegates of this convention actually urged secession of New England from the United States. And this would actually establish a precedent later used by the South when it comes to the Civil War. So some of the amendments that this convention recommended actually seemed pretty reasonable. A 2/3 vote of Congress would be required for an embargo. A 2/3 vote of Congress would be required to declare war, and a 2/3 vote of Congress would be required to admit new states. Also repeal the 3/5 Act. So these were kind of reasonable, but nevertheless, this convention would outrage the rest of America. So this convention, many of the ideas might have been reasonable, but the fact that the Federalist elites were focusing on gaining compensation for the war, proposing amendments to the Constitution, and possibly even secession from the U.S. at the end of a major national war represented a lack of nationalism and even traitorship to the Republicans. This would basically just lead to the death of the Federalist Party. So keep in mind that this convention occurred before the Battle of New Orleans. So at this point, before the Battle of New Orleans, the war wasn't too popular among the Americans. It wasn't really, anything special or patriotic. I mean, yes, we had the Star-Spangled Banner and everything, but the Battle of New Orleans was the one that really hit it home for the Americans. So the problem with this was that this convention became viewed by many Republicans after the Battle of New Orleans happened as making the Federalists seem like traitors because, they were proposing amendments and doing all this stuff. Well, really, they should be focusing on supporting the U.S. and, celebrating this war and continuing expansion and whatnot. So basically, Federalists died, and for the next 8 years, starting in 1816, America's government would consist of a one-party system. Additionally, the era of good feeling was another consequence of this war, which was a period following the War of 1812 under President James Monroe, in which there was a huge increase in nationalism in America. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue our journey throughout U.S. history. The following political cartoon pretty much sums up the Republicans' view on the Federalist Party and the Hartford Convention in general. So they're viewing the Federalists as traitors. The three people in the top left-hand corner basically represent 3 states from New England, Federalist states that is, basically Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and they're seen as wanting to lead into King George's hands. This is the King of England at the time. So they are basically falling into British hands, kind of supporting British policies, and they're still pro-British and not really embracing this war. And this piece of propaganda kind of shows that. I think the Federalist views were largely misinterpreted because the convention did occur before the Battle of New Orleans. So this just shows how much that battle shaped the Republicans' view on the Federalist Party. So I'd like to finish with a few quotes that exemplify the national character and patriotism that resulted from the War of 1812. This one was written by Albert Gallatin in 1816. The war has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and character which the Revolution had given, and which were daily lessened. The people are more American, they feel and act more as a nation, and I hope the permanency of the Union is thereby better secured. So he's literally comparing the War of 1812 to the Revolution and how much it encouraged American nationalism and patriotism. So clearly, this war did have a great effect on the pride that Americans still continue to exemplify today. And very well known, obviously, by Francis Scott Key, I felt that this part of the Star-Spangled Banner really demonstrates the patriotism in America. Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. So these quotes lead us to the overall consequence of this war, kind of the overarching theme that this war had in U.S. history. So it led to the U.S. now being seen as a major player on the world stage, bolstering the pride and patriotism Americans continue to exemplify to this day. So this war is often overlooked in U.S. history, but I'd argue that it really shouldn't be, considering its huge effect that has on American culture today. Perhaps besides the Revolutionary War, or possibly even greater than the Revolutionary War, the effect it had on patriotism in America is just insanely significant. So I'd just like to end with a few discussion questions to keep in mind when talking about the War of 1812. So first off, how did Native Americans relate to the War of 1812? Did they play a role in the causes of the war, effects, or both? I feel like the Native Americans are often a side that's often overlooked in this war. It's often seen as just the British versus the U.S., but really, Native Americans played a highly significant role. So I guess just contemplate that. What characteristics of the Federalists led them to oppose the war and die out quickly after the war? And also, how would this war affect the United States' foreign and internal policies for the rest of the century? So as you continue studying U.S. history, you'll probably see that throughout the Civil War and some of the isolationism that the U.S. exemplified throughout the rest of the century was probably largely due to this war itself. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.